Hello, and welcome to another episode of Surroundscapes, the podcast series that's sponsored by Blue Sound Professional, covering all sorts of areas of the AV industry. This time we have another one of our Hot Topics episodes, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the show Tracy Wymer, who I've known for a little while now, who does really, really interesting work in the environment of the workspace. So welcome, Tracy.
Oh, thank you, Graeme. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Let's start by you talking through your career today, how you got to where you got to now.
Well, it's a very circuitous path, but let's see how we can get there. At its core, I'm trained as a designer, industrial design. I was able to really, even at the early stages, launch my own firm, keep humans at the center of engagement relative to product and environments, and then, made it into the world of architecture and interior architecture specifically, then started getting into more workplace and workplace strategies, and then ultimately landed with a manufacturer, which was Knoll, and began leading research, strategy, some applications, and then some product innovation. So that's very much the short version. And then today I'm on the dealer side with a dealer in San Francisco called KBM Hogue, which is a commercial furniture dealer that Miller Knoll is their aligned manufacturer.
Okay. Wow, that was brief. So
we can go into any one of those facets in more detail.
Yeah, I certainly want to pick up on a couple of things there. You mentioned you launched your own company. Was that early on in your career?
Very early, yes. I started out as a partner in a firm that was, once again, everything I've always tried to do was linked. I always tried to keep things multidisciplinary. I think that's one of the, I don't want to put it as a problem, but I think that's one of the challenges that we have many times in solving issues, big issues, is that the problems become so siloed. So early on, it was about, okay, what design engagement can I bring people into? And I used to say, whether you're working on the cube or within the cube, it's the same process. It's a matter of scale. So how do we think about that from a scalability standpoint? And then also, what's the right network to bring in? There's an ecosystem around all these things that I think make everyone successful. And like yourself and the conversations we have, the right ecosystem and the right professionals bring a better result.
So specifically talking about bringing people into design, what was your own company focused on, or the company you were a partner in?
Yeah, it was, as I said, really focused on just design process, and whether it was, we did everything from branding to packaging to environments to interiors. We did restaurants. We were all over the place. And then that's when the opportunity came up to really be more focused on an architectural standpoint, because as that scale grew, as I started working within the cube, if you will, architecture became a much more interesting application, and how people are at the center of that, which I found very fascinating. What is their experience when you're looking at some of these things in plan or in whatever the viewing portal is? What is the person's perspective on that? And what's impacting their relationship with that space? Yes, it's color, material, finish, daylight, all these types of things, but it's actually what the architects and designers do that influence that human's experience. And for me, that's always been at the center of my thinking and passion about design.
And just as a audio person here, I'm curious to know, when you were working within the architectural space, was the sound of the space considered, or were you strictly involved in the visual design of the space?
Well, sound has always been an irritant, mostly, for workplace, especially if you rank the top two complaints from workplace, it's my office is too hot or too cold, or it's too distracting. And distractions usually have to do with sound interruptions. And also it's it's a concentration drain. If you get interrupted, it can be a 15-second interruption, but it can take you 20 minutes to get back to what you were focused on. So the
Hmm.
whole notion of you being really focused in the impact that sound has as we work through all the different senses, as we work through even just things like circulation as you pass through a space, what the footfalls are, and that type of thing. The notion of color or material, what the impact those have. Well, something that wasn't always emphasized was the impact of sound. And even when we were looking at it in just a number of years ago, let's say 10 years ago, we really looked at it almost as something to either absorb, block, or cover. And we always said it was the ABCs of sound. But I think what's progressed is how do we view sound as an active design element? And that becomes, I think, much more fascinating to me. It becomes much more fascinating as far as its impact on wellness, which is a big driver right now
Hmm.
in the world of workplace, emotional well-being, as well as just creating vibes. You create a good vibe in a zoned area of the workplace, it will attract people, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, it is. So you ended up, you mentioned going to work for Knoll. I'm really interested. I've worked with a few of the furniture companies, and I'm really interested in your experience working with Knoll, what you did there, and how they looked at kind of the workspace beyond just the furniture.
I was very fortunate. I came into Knoll. I spent the bulk of my career at Knoll, and I came in as a researcher, and it really, they were really understood my inquisitive nature that I was always looking to solve for what's next. So in leading research, and the notion that Knoll, as being founded by Florence Knoll, she had an active research. She was always, researching work environment and environments in general. So in continuing that legacy, we continued that investigation into the impacts of what's going on in the workplace. So that resulted in new planning paradigms that start impacting product. As you start planning differently, is there a void or a black hole of product that's missing? And then that would parlay into a design brief where then we could really rally all the teams around, okay, what does this mean from a product platform standpoint? And could that be applied to workplace in a more robust manner to really meet the research goals we were able to identify? And I think the
Mhm.
beauty with Knoll is that their history and legacy and their passion for design still exists,
Mhm.
and it was really beneficial to just understand that investigative, almost theoretical, strategic component, but then practically, how does that get translated into a design solution that makes the environment better for the occupants that will ultimately occupy that space?
Mhm. And during your time at Knoll, I'm sure you were involved in a number of both projects and products. What are some of the ones that you've been the most proud of?
Well, we developed a process once again early when we were investigating workplace about keeping design relevant in the workplace. There was a period of time when things were just, it was, I'm going to use the word junky. There were a lot of, let's say eclectic. Maybe that's a better word. Things
Hmm.
were very eclectic. And how do we, take a more design-centric approach to that? So we went around North America. We did investigated with thought leaders and stakeholders across North America. We captured their thoughts. We synthesized that thinking, and we put it into a brief that really wasn't, that, everything has to be, X by Y dimensions. It was more kind of a performance brief. How should this perform? And that resulted, the first round, that resulted in antenna workspace. So the whole antenna platform for Knoll came out of that brief. And that was, very successful, kind of, connected the relevance of what was happening on the West Coast, where I'm based, with the center of manufacturing and design thinking at the time in New York, which was the headquarters for Knoll. And then, as we looked at that from an approach standpoint, when the time came to, work had changed, there had been significant shifts, if you will, in technology or generational shifts that were occurring, another opportunity came up. And we repeated, we like to say we wash, rinse, repeat. We went through the same process and came up with Rockwell Unscripted, which was probably the most robust platform Knoll ever launched. I believe there were 7 product categories, from soft architectural walls to lounge furniture to tables and desks and lounge furniture. So it was really robust, but I think it also reflected what was going on in the marketplace right then and how it really made people kind of at the center of that user interface
Hmm.
with product.
Hmm. When was that launched, roughly?
That's a good question. Probably 2016.
Okay, so
Yeah,
fairly recently.
yeah.
You mentioned in passing the phrase design thinking. Did you use a formal process of design thinking at Knoll?
Well, my background was really rooted in industrial design process thinking. So it's like, how do you begin with research? How do you then synthesize, analyze, and then get to execution? And fortunately, Knoll had already that was already kind of baked into their DNA with their history, with their legacy. That was something that became very compatible. So I'd like to say my integration into Knoll was pretty smooth and pretty receptive. Um, and also, I think it was interesting early on as I went through the kind of like an 8 interview day process in New York. At the end of it, our CEO at the time said, "Okay, great. When's he moving to New York?" And fortunately, our president said, "No, he needs to stay right where he is in San Francisco to make sure that we're capturing the thinking that's happening on the West Coast and integrating into that design thinking that was already present at Knoll."
Hmm. Yeah, the reason I ask was because the formal discipline of design thinking, which I think was developed by a combination of IDEO and the D School at
Yeah.
Stanford, is something that when I worked at Biamp we used, and I always liken it. Well, it's the simplest way of looking at it is a 4-step process, which first of all is rooted in ethnography and identifying customer needs, and most pertinently unarticulated customer needs, so ones they don't even know they need.
Yeah.
And then into a process of ideation. So, allying a need to a technology to produce an idea, and then we had these things called word cafes, which were
Hmm.
like moderated, complete blue sky sessions,
Yeah.
where no idea was too stupid, and kind of going way out there, and then kind of funneling back in to get a really well implemented idea, or kind of considered idea. And then the one we had the hardest job with, and I think many people do, is iteration, not
Hmm.
going into a waterfall process, but like fail fast, fail small, fail often was
Hmm.
our motto at that stage, of just kind of doing experiments and working out what's working, what's not working. And then going into the final stage was the implementation, getting it to market as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
Was that a formal process you used?
I mean, very akin. I would say the notion of going out and at stage one, really getting I'd like to say the lay of the land, but the voice of the customer, and going across from key markets and bringing those stakeholders together. And it's interesting. Many people go into these sessions and they think they have to have a whole litany of questions. At the end of the day, you maybe need 3 to 5, and the people really just run with it if you have the right stakeholders in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And how you capture that, I think, becomes so key. It's Sometimes it's those readily adjacent ideas that are really important. Everybody's like, "Oh, we're waiting for that big idea." Well, sometimes there's something just readily adjacent that you can identify and you can put some energy behind, and it kind of turns into a big idea.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the ability to identify that. So going out and capturing the voices of the participants. And it's always been baffling through my career that so many companies don't spend as much time as they should with their customer, and really listening to their customer.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about that as kind of a guiding principle of your professional career, people are like, oh, it must be really unique. I said, I think it's just, table stakes. It's like where you begin. If you really want to understand where your customer is and to better then synthesize where they may want to go, you have to spend time with them. And so
Mhm.
I was always very customer facing when it came to it. And what happened over the years, the customer for workplace just diversified. I mean, it used to be, we like to laugh, it was like me smoking a cigar with the CEO determining the fate of every worker. Well, that was, many, many decades ago. Today, there's, worker health, worker safety, there's workplace strategists, there's architects, there's designers, there's, sound advisors. So I think that the ecosystem that really supports the workplace and the workforce today is so much broader and richer and just brings that diversity to thinking that makes solutions even better.
Yeah, we sometimes didn't even talk to the customer. We just observed the customer,
Hmm.
because often we found the customers had the end users had found ways around problems, subconsciously, and a good example of that for us in the audio industry was placing video conference calls, which took between 8 and 10 minutes on average in the
Yep.
industry. Even Microsoft, who was a customer of ours,
Mhm.
would say anything under 7 minutes is a success. So you're taking more than 10 minutes of your hour-long meeting just to place the call to your other office. And so what people did was they book the room 15 minutes early and send a tech in to
You get
place
it
the
set up.
call beforehand, so that by the time the executives came in, the call was placed. And they kind of solved the problem, but they'd used another 15 minutes of that meeting room space that was unusable to anyone else, and 15 minutes of a technician, um, in order to just have it be a frictionless experience to the executives. And it was like, what if you didn't have to do that?
Right.
I always use the example of Windows and Mac computers. So most people that use Windows computers, I don't know what it's like now because I don't use them, but back in the day, they wouldn't go to sleep reliably. So people would turn them off totally and then come in the morning and open the computer and turn the power on and then go and get a coffee and talk to their mates. And then they
Exactly.
come back
Right.
5 minutes later and the computer was ready for them. And if you ask them, is your computer responsive? Is it ready? Yeah, it's ready whenever I need it. Because they worked out this strategy for getting around the problem. And they wouldn't even articulate it. If you asked them, is there a problem with your computer? They said, no, it's fine.
Mhm.
But if you watched them, you'd say, well, they're waiting 5 minutes before they come back. Why are you waiting? Well, it doesn't, it takes 5 minutes to start up. Okay, that's a problem.
That's a
You
problem.
may have found a way around it, but there may be the day that you've got to get something done and you come in, you open it up, and you say, or the conference call you do where you can't be in the room 15 minutes in advance. And it's kind of watching the pain points. And human beings are really good at finding ways around.
Workarounds. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and it's just looking at it, seeing their pain points. We found even asking them wasn't sometimes didn't work because they didn't even know they had them. They'd subconsciously fixed them. Um,
Yeah. I think it's this balance between, asking lightly, observing, deeply. And it's so funny you mentioned about tech in the meeting space and, you know, still working on it. And I mean, the whole notion of how do you make a more inclusive setting for all participants, whether you're virtual or in person. I
mhm.
mean, I still don't think, everybody's kind of just nailed it. And then also understanding the technologies that is at the interface between the people and the viewer. Understand there's things like parallax in a camera lens that happens, and how do you take advantage of that instead of just suffering through it?
Mhm.
How do you create a shape or environment that is inclusive? It brings people together, whether they're virtual or whether they're in person. Like the same space should be able to very, robustly host a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. There shouldn't be, any problems with that.
Yeah, I
And
think.
it's even going back to, you made me think of some of the findings in the research around tech in the room environments. And I think it's that elusive still today. Well, we're probably closer than we've ever been. They said it had to be one touch. You just had to. I'm like, well, okay, that was like 12 years ago, and we're still, we're finally getting to the point where we're almost one touch.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that with technology, AV technology specifically in the space,
Hmm.
is it doesn't do a good job of learning. So, for example, if I come into the same meeting room every Tuesday and place the same conference call, it doesn't learn that that's what I do. My thermostat learns, my car learns, but my meeting space doesn't. And another particular bugbear of mine is that our industry, the AV industry, is totally focused on the meeting space, and I
Mm.
actually think the most interesting work in the workplace is happening outside the meeting rooms. And we as an AV industry are focused particularly in the huddle room space, which is like ultra commoditized, and there's numbers of rooms is huge, but the differentiation and the value you can bring is small until you get to things like, as you mentioned, equity in meetings, and a remote participants as well valued as local participants. I'm kind of interested to see when people start doing sentiment tracking. So
Hmm.
people are beginning to track, how many people were in the meeting room. Was that a good use of that meeting room? Did you book a 20-person meeting room to have a 4-person meeting because you couldn't find another one?
Hmm.
Um, that's being done now, but was it a happy meeting? Was it an equitable meeting? What was it a productive meeting? Um, and that's going to be, I think, the next area to me of interest.
Well, it might be, it'd also be fascinating if the room did that tracking.
Mhm.
The room at the end of it said whether it was happy or good, or they
Oh,
were engaged, or that versus any individual.
yeah. I'm
Yeah,
talking about automated. I'm not
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about
absolutely.
that this was tracked locally. You also mentioned something earlier about interdisciplinary work, and again, this has been kind of my history because my first degree is in chemistry, but
Mm.
specifically biochemistry. And biochemistry was this kind of new thing in between biology and chemistry when I took it, and kind of both of the established disciplines turned their noses down at it because it was new, and they were kind of frustrated because it was sexy and getting publicity, and their disciplines weren't so much. But right from then, and actually, even then, that process I was talking about with design thinking of iteration is exactly what you do if you're a chemist or a biochemist. You
Hmm.
formulate something, you work out, does it work? If so, can I tweak it and make it work better? If not, how do I tweak it to make it work? So that was kind of a right built into my university. It's one of the only things that is still useful to me from my chemical education. But that thought of I really believe that the most interesting stuff happens in between disciplines, not at the center of a discipline, and that the most interesting ideas, to your point a little earlier, are not like bolts from the blue, but are just like, oh, hang on a minute, if we use this from here and this from here and
Exactly.
this from here, we get something that's kind of super interesting.
Yeah, and I've been incredibly fortunate, and I was brought into a group. I guess it was January of last year, through UC Berkeley, through the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces. A woman, Dr. Christina Banks, is leading this initiative. It's called the Work Futures Initiative. And I thought, okay, this is pretty interesting. And what's it about? Well, it's about exactly what we're discussing. How do you how do you speak to people that have historically not been asked about the future, how they're shaping their life for the future, how they view work today, what are their challenges in between work and life, and so they had a process that was really kind of interesting, that they were hosting virtual sandboxes, they referred to them, which was really just a safe space for people to engage in a conversation. So I was asked to join the leadership team, and we continue to roll out these sandboxes. I believe there were 18 of them. So we're talking to everybody from CEOs and investors to artists and writers to students to union leaders, union representatives, technologists, and capturing just their passionate kind of conversation about very simple prompts. Once again, the prompts were very simple. As a matter of fact, when I came on board, they'd been doing it for about, I'd say 6 months already. And I looked at the prompts and they were a little, they felt a little dated. They felt like, they were a little musty. And I said, would we consider updating them? They said, no, because it's scientific research. Those have to remain constant. So they did. And what was fascinating about the sandboxes is they were so lightly facilitated. I mean, our participation was many times we were observers and we were recording the sessions, and we this rich database of all these transcripts. So we've been combing through that, and we just published. So the culmination of the sandboxes is a published book called Unfiltered Voices, which I thought was a brilliant title. Because these are voices, as I mentioned, that historically were not asked about these things, were not brought into the conversation of workplace. So that was published. I think it published, it arrived in Berkeley February 23rd. We're going to have a whole series of book launch events around the country. The first one in March in San Francisco, and then we're going to go to Austin, New York, Minneapolis, Chicago, Atlanta. So we'll kind of keep you up to date on where the next book launch is. We're hoping to do one in Seattle as well. I know it's close to you.
Yeah, that would be the closest. So,
Mm.
so tell me a little more about this book. It's the conversations that were had in these sandboxes.
Exactly. And what happened is, well, human dynamics were at the center of all the conversations. We went through and just re-listened and reread all the transcript. But it's also about, what are some of the universal goals? Are leaderships well prepared for what they're trying to manage? They're being asked to do so much more. Do they have the right tools even in place? Workers who are really struggling with worker health, worker well-being, and what can be put in place to really, think about that in a more holistic standpoint. And how can we learn from the occupational health therapists that are involved in the sandboxes and parlay that into the workplace strategists that are involved in the sandbox and say, hey, you two should get together. You should really spend some time and learn from each other. There's some good things here. So the whole balance of this is really just, once again, human at the center, but it's impacting all the things around built space, the environment that it exists in, but also the tools for leadership that are necessary, but also then just the structure of business business infrastructure writ large. That's an opportunity for improvement. Because it's odd. I think coming out of the pandemic, and we did a lot of when I was at Knoll, I think we did had a great team. We did some phenomenal work that looked at what is the impact of all this, and from a planning standpoint, from a user interface standpoint, from a user experience standpoint, when we're thinking about an environment that people would ultimately come back to. And it seemed we learned so much, and then we come out and it's like, oh, we put that in a balloon and let it float away. And here it's going, and so much of what we're hearing from some teams are people are going back to that old playbook. They're going back to the 2019 playbook and saying, oh, well, that was a hit in 2019. Don't we want to play it again? I'm
Hmm.
like, well, no, I think we didn't get it all right then either. So how do we really rethink that from an application standpoint that may be healthier for the humans moving forward. And one of the things that's as we look, if you have a healthier workforce, fewer days off, less absenteeism, presenteeism, those types of things, it's actually a better bottom line for the company as well. So
Hmm.
it's a nice kind of holistic look at the workforce, the workplace, and business that is at the epicenter of how these things really come to be.
Hmm. And who's the audience for the book? Who would you recommend reads it?
That's a conversation I think we have weekly with the team because it comes to the point where it's like who shouldn't read it? as we look, architects, designers, workplace strategists, health people, that type of thing. So I think there's a whole, bevy of stakeholders that would find an interest in this, because the book is organized according to major themes. It's all key. There's icons. It's a kind of an easy flow, but it's rich and it's deep. So there's a lot to it. But I think it's anyone who has even a slight interest of workplace and it's not even the workplace, but it's the work life experience that
Mm-hmm.
we look at this, you know, we talk about it. I'm going back to like the stockyards of Chicago where the work was just grueling, and at the evening it was meeting at a saloon and having beers, and the social was a major necessary distraction from the work. Where we are today, where work and social is so intertwined, that it's, if they say if you can create a friend at work, then that's a tighter bond as far as you in the workforce. And how social is woven into work today, and how people have to really manage that. I really don't use the word balance. I don't think there's a real balance. It's a conscious management of it, and I think there has to be latitude on both sides for it to be successful. Like if you have an aging parent or a young child, the dynamic is about the same. You have to care for both, or even an aging pet. But the flexibility, the inherent flexibility and latitude that the organization has to provide you, is the same. It's really the same thing.
Yeah, it's long been interesting, frustrating, I think is a better word,
There you go.
to me that so many workplaces are kind of one size fits all. You go
Yep.
in there and you have your desk, your cubicle, your whatever it is, and
And
you
go there to do this.
yeah.
Right?
But what you do changes during your day, your week. You might be super focused getting a report done. You might be, I don't know, kicking back, reading trade journals. You might be doing something that's more social. And a lot of workplaces don't provide for that. It's like we have meeting rooms and we have desks
Right.
and we have nothing else. Do you want to be in a meeting room? Do you want to be in a desk?
Right. Or,
And
there was this, explosion of lounge or ancillary furniture that, it was put in, but people didn't really know what to quite do with it.
Mhm.
And it's funny, because some of the quotes speak to the notion of, oh, work is broken, or the inherent support systems aren't really well suited to move work and workplace forward. And the analogy that was put forth actually in the book was, it's not that, people are running down the halls screaming, oh, the work's not working. It's really more the pebble in the shoe analogy, that yes, you can walk with that pebble in the shoe for a bit, but
Mhm.
if you're, after a few miles, it becomes an irritant. And let's just remove the pebble and get to a better place as far as solving these core issues relative to humans, and humans at the center of kind of a multidimensional experience between built environments, what is going on from a transit component, what's going on from their human life-centered experience at the home, and how all those elements come to support the work. We like to say this is not a book that we're not even having the conversation about return to the office, because that's not the conversation. It's a conversation about a new paradigm for how offices and organizations can create an environment that is rich and attractive to all parties, whether you're managing the company or participating in the company, and making sure that there's a trusted contract reinstilled, um, after years of, quite frankly, kind of a broken contract between workforce and the employer.
So I have one practical question about these sandboxes. You mentioned you had everyone in them from like janitors to CEOs. Were they in the same sandbox, or did you have
No,
a? Okay.
we had them all separate, and so there was also a freedom to express themselves. I remember the fascinating one was with the musicians and the creatives, and early on, they're, in their conversation, they're like, "What are we doing here?" They're, and their whole thing is, performing gigs at night, and, it's like they don't really set foot in an office. At the end, I think we were 2 hours together, plus breakout rooms, and they said we could have talked for another 2 hours. So the whole, the richness of these conversations, the passion I think that people showed during this process, I think is what's captured in the book and what's captured in their quotes that are the voices in the book.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something in passing about kind of lounge spaces and this sort of thing. As you design a more flexible, multifunctional workspace, how do you help people to understand how to use it?
We've gone through so many iterate. You use the word iterate. We've had many iterations of that premise over time. And the best example I've always kind of experienced was if leadership shows the way, if leadership shows how this works for them, if leadership participates in that environment, if leadership really takes the lead in saying, this is a welcome environment for all, we're all safe here, and this is how I'm going to use it, but you may use it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been so much more successful than any like change management program that gets in place or anything like that. It's just active users at a level, and and leadership. I look at it, it's not just specifically org chart leaders, but sometimes there's like a social network leader within the community of the workplace. So how they really go about using those applications, I think, really speaks volumes, I should say, to how the application is geared for success or not. And
Mm-hmm.
I think also the willingness to then adapt it. You're going back to our conversation about listening and observing. If you created something that was, once again, just something you pulled out of the hat because it was done for other clients and plugged it in and say, hey, try this, it might work. That's not a curated approach. That's not listening to what is going on within the social structure of that particular organization and
Mm-hmm.
what their needs might be. So I think we have to also just try not to be so easy. And this is hard stuff. I mean, we're essentially engaged in a social experiment on bringing diverse people together into one space, technically aligned around a common goal. And
Mm-hmm.
that is not an easy task. And I think to better understand all the dynamics that impact that, and the richness that that opportunity really presents, um, I think is what keeps me, getting up every morning and with a passion to continue to do this stuff. And I think, the Work Futures initiatives is a nice, nice launch pad for that. Right now, we have the book, we've published the book, and we went back and forth. It's like, why do we want to publish a book that seems, so old school? But there's something, substantial about holding a book and being able to flip through it still, as well as having an ebook that you can scroll and search and do a targeted search. The next phase for this is a mixer that's coming up in April at the Haas Business School in campus at UC Berkeley. And then later in 2026, there will be a summit. So it's not like we have the answers right now. We have the data. And the mixer is going to knit some of this data, these key data points together. And then the summit will start creating the tools that will have an application out in the marketplace.
Hmm.
So it's exciting.
Interesting. It's interesting when I hear you talk because so many of the things that you say, we also see in the AV world. So, for example, you mentioned don't pull out a previous design and it's like a one size fits all. We have that all the time in our industry with people, with both integrators and consultants, pulling out stuff they've done before and trying to shoehorn it into a different environment.
Mhm.
And I mean, I get why they do it. A, because they know it worked. It worked before, so why shouldn't it work now? And B, because it's obviously easy and cheaper. And it's interesting to me as I watch people do that, how do we produce design tools that makes it easy and cost effective to be flexible, so that you can start from scratch each time, but not have it be hugely time consuming, hugely expensive. Um, and and as we develop kind of audio tools and tools to help people deploy our gear, that's always front of mind. How do we allow people to have the flexibility to propose the right solution, but do it in a cost-effective way, knowing that they won't always win the job. So the time they spend doing it might actually be completely waste of time if they don't win the job.
I even from a language, I'm a believer in the right language for all this. We always refer to product categories at Knoll as platforms, and I know that's very very much common in the tech space as well. But if you look at it more as a platform, then you can build off that. That's a launch pad to
Mhm.
other iterations, the word you used earlier. It's like if you have foundation there, either from a geometry or mechanics or even a technology component, it's much easier to iterate off of a platform than, to your point, starting from scratch, starting from ground zero and trying to do it from nothing. So
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I think the notion of platforms as platform-based thinking is also important as well, as long as they don't anchor you, as long as they don't restrict you, that you realize it's a place to launch from, not a place just to end up every time.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And then there was something else that you were talking about that again links into to our technology, and it's around moving from hierarchical structures to more peer-to-peer structures.
Mhm.
We see it in the audio, in the AV world or the audio world. A friend of mine, a consultant from Dallas called Craig Jansen, talked about the fact that AV equipment was designed for one to speak to many, whereas the reality of the workplace nowadays is people talking to each other on a more peer-to-peer level. And I think that the workplace was designed kind of to have the boss and the corner office and the worker bees in their cubicles. And I still, when I go to Japan, I still see the odd office where there's a load of workers and like a supervisor facing them, kind of making sure that they're not slacking. Um, how have you found that the built environment of the workplace can facilitate that more kind of peer to peer?
I think looking, less of it as this monolith and looking at, it's up, in the, especially in the furniture world, system, the word system, I was kind of almost bastardized in a way, where system, if you look at system thinking and system-based thinking, it's a series of components that can work in harmony together. It's like, hey, that's a cool thing. But a furniture system that is a cubicle may not be perceived as being a cool thing, although there's a little bit of a resurgence on the value of a cubicle these days. I'm not sure I'm on board completely with it, but so I think as we look at these things as, once again, various hubs within the environment, and there are spokes that are linking it together, that becomes a more interesting dynamic of how to solve for this. If you can zone an area and that vibe of that zone relative not only to the setting and the materials and the finish, but the sound as well, starts creating a unique vibe. And even if, and more, it's kind of easier for the sound, if that shifts over the course of the day, or the number of people that are in that space, or the dynamics, the volume that the people are in that space creating or not, then that becomes a richer experience than it's static, it's this way the whole day, and nothing ever changes. I think another avenue for exploration as well is lighting. The notion of lighting comes into play in manipulating that same type of thing. But going back to that, there's various kind of, if you will, hubs. One is also that distinction between, as we look at sound at a macro level, like, how do you cover sound on a big space, or you cover it in a zoned area, but it's basically coming from above. There's that macro, kind of role. But on a micro level, there is sound coming today from every source. These events, a video call, which is almost commonplace today. There's an amplified sound coming from a device here. There's also what you do as a human. You project more when you're on these calls because you want to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And then you layer in the bots that are kind of talking back to us and giving us guidance and always thanking us for, oh, that's a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
It just adds to this cacophony of sound that is making up the workplace today. So how do we just, we go in and we look at it almost surgically and say, okay, macro level, we can zone some things, we can get it very targeted. On a micro level, is there a way we can really manipulate some personal sound experiences that are going to make all this? It's not ever going to go away. But can we mitigate it, and can we make it so it's less of a emotional drain on us because our mind isn't processing, hey, I'm trying to eliminate all this distraction in my brain while I try to do my work, that it is a little more sympathetic to what you're doing. I don't know
Yeah.
if we can. I don't know if we can use the word sympathetic with sound technology, but maybe, I don't know.
No, you can. You definitely can, and I think there's lots of things from what you've just said. I mean, the first thing is before you start putting more stuff into a space, look at subtracting stuff from the space. The first thing I tell people is don't think about what sound system you can put in. Think about the acoustics of your space and
Yep.
think about taking out things that are creating noise. Like think about your HVAC system. Think about your vending machines and your chiller cabinets and all the other things that are putting on a structural level noise into the environment, and then think about how you might intentionally feed sound into a space. And I think this cacophony, where, as you say, it's it's like the pedal in the shoe. You can walk, but it's a pain, and it's interesting because people, when they started to work remotely during the pandemic, found they could be very productive because there weren't the distractions. And as you know, we're working with Mood Sonic now that's doing biophilic
Mm-hmm.
soundscaping the workspace. And there's actually workspaces they've worked with now where people prefer to come in because they're more effective coming in, and that to me is delightful that we can actually make a positive impact rather than a negative one, particularly because we're replacing often sound masking systems, which is
Mm-hmm.
putting pink noise, frequency shaped pink noise into a space. And we do that tuning out subconsciously, but we're still doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's still causing us stress and making us tired. And to be able to not do that and more intentionally put things into a space that we've already cleared away of extraneous stuff, sonically this is,
Mm-hmm.
um, feels just so much more constructive.
I think one of the harshest critiques of an office space of a workplace is I can't get my work done there. I can't focus there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like kind of why it was created. It's like the whole notion of work, and being able to do your work in that space was why it was created. Yes, we've had this experience that there's a different experience. I would say there's a different interplay at work at home, where, hey, you can take a break and put a load of laundry on. Hey, you can take a break and go out to a garden. Hey, you can take a break and make yourself lunch in your own kitchen, that type of thing. That's a different interplay that happens, that individuals should have the liberty to make those decisions about where they show up on a given day. But to critique an office and say, I don't go in because I can't get my focus work done, I think is the harshest critique to levy on an office
Yeah,
space.
yeah, and I think the downside of that is you can get a lot done at home, but creativity requires, well, in for me, even as an introvert, for me,
Mm.
requires me to be in the space with other people. And really, even though I work in a AV tech industry, the virtual meeting is not as effective to me as the real, the face-to-face meeting. And being able to bring people into delightful spaces, to allow them to rub up against each other and have those corridor conversations that aren't scripted, and coffee bar conversations. And just as we were talking about earlier in the conversation about some of the best ideas being at the intersection of things, some of the best ideas are also sparked between people that probably have no business talking to each other, but can see the world from a completely different space.
You're spot on in the fact that as we began this conversation talking about different disciplines needing to really spend more time together, that's the beauty of this. That's where this a social structure like work starts having some richness to it, and a true benefit. I mean, even harkening back there, I've partnered with, I did a lot of work with Google over the years, and remember we were in a facility and we were observing the line at the lineup for the barista, and the person who was leading that facility said, "Oh," or somebody said, "Oh, you should get another espresso machine." But we paused and we looked at what was going on in the line. There were conversations happening between people that didn't even work on the same floors, let alone the same departments. It's like, no, I think we're good. We'll leave this, to create that negotiated tension that needs to occur within the workplace. And I want to segue to that because I think there's, something that came out of the sandboxes were these inherent tensions that, even as we looked at intention, it's historically it's between like work and home. We said, no, it's not work and home, it's work and care. How do you care for your life? And then how do you care, how do you take care of your work? That there's a tension, inherent tension within that. So I think we've identified like 8 unique tensions that were inherent through all the conversations that we had. So we're going to continue to explore those more during our mixer that's coming up, and then hopefully during the summit get some really cool tools that come out of that as well.
Interesting. So what we haven't covered is what you're doing now, what your day job is now, and why you're doing what you're doing now.
Well, with KBM Hogue, I mean, the beauty is just bringing this thought leadership to a dealer, a dealer network, and also being able to solve problems on a very physical front. To say, hey, if we build a table this way, it will be a better experience for the users, not only for the people in the room, but for people virtually that are outside the room. So looking at it from a product application standpoint that can really improve the experience of the customer, and hopefully have a message that positions us as a trusted partner as we work with our clients to say we're not just going to pull the solutions out of our hat that we've always pulled out for customers. And KBM fortunately has a rich history of being a very curated shop. They very much curate their solutions for their clients. They have a great partnership with the architecture and design community and great relationships with the client community. But just looking at those adjacent next opportunities. What's the adjacent next opportunity that we can bring to the table that either from a product standpoint or a thinking standpoint or even a technology standpoint is going to make the richness of the experience that KBM Hogue can deliver for their customers more authentic and transparent.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. My own experience over the years, I was a research biochemist, and it was intellectually super challenging because I was publishing papers and speaking at conferences, but it lacked real world impact because the stuff I was doing has a 25-year gestation period of long and short-term toxicology studies and things. So it was very abstract, and ultimately that got frustrating, even though intellectually it was super challenging. And so I ended up kind of working in screen ink manufacturer, which was more like cookery, that I got to
Mm-hmm.
field test with the customers, and I've ended up in a sales career or a running company type career, because I can see the impact of what I'm doing. And to this day, I get up ladders and do installations here in Portland,
Right.
even though I run a company, because I want to know what our products are like to put to hang on a wall. And I never want to not do that. And so it's interesting to see you having come from kind of design companies through manufacturing companies to a dealer now and getting closer to the customer.
Yeah. And
Uh,
it's also with a builder mindset. I mean, I've always kind of, I think I'm on my second, classic wooden boat I'm restoring. So, you're always, like, we talk about design, and there's, design with the big D, and then there's design that just talks about problem solving on a very, practical level as well. And I think I've always practiced more the latter. It's like, how do we really solve some practical problems and make it available for as many people who want it, and just finding, to your point about audience. So I think that builder mentality is kind of inherent, maybe in us both, that we want to see how things get done. You don't, there's a beauty in understanding the theory around all this, but there's a true magic when it comes to the practical application of that theory.
Absolutely. So as we draw to a close, we've talked a lot about what you've done in the past, what you're doing now. Where do you see the future of the workplace if you look forward 5 or 10 years? Um,
You know, that's the $65,000 question. As a matter of fact, a former owner of KBM Hogue put a quote of mine on one of their walls in one of their showrooms, which was, "There is no workplace of the future. There's only change." It's so I think setting up a platform for this work life experience that businesses have to provide that is almost meant to change. I think so often we get stuck in this, like, oh, we have to do it, it has to be right, and it has to be done. Change is tough for a lot of people. Change is complicated. Change can be very messy. But if we kind of switch to the notion that change is the backbone, change is the premise that we're working from, then change becomes enriching. Change becomes nourishing. Change becomes something that we can really rally behind because it's our expectation. Our expectation is that this will change. And it's not, our expectation isn't that this is just going to remain the same way every day from now on. So as I look to the future, it's like, if we find a better balance with humans at the center and the notion of the human employer relationship being better aligned, if we look at a rich multi-sensorial experience that humans can participate in, and we're able to replicate that in as many, it becomes more the norm than the exception.
mhm.
Wow, I think that's a great future to look forward to.
Yeah, and I think I agree. The only thing that's constant is change. But I had a executive coach that I hired for our exec team in my previous company, and she talked about change being like standing on one riverbank and looking at another riverbank with the river running in between. And most people want to, if they have to jump off the bank, they know, want to get in and out of that river as quickly as possible. Whereas the most creative, enlivening time is while you're in the river. And if you can try and stay in that river a little longer and be comfortable in that river a little longer, that other bank could be totally different to how you expected it to be.
You just make me think of there was a great colleague of mine I worked with on a lot of kind of wild thinking, and she would kind of make it a reality and keep pushing the ball down the road. But we were talking to, as we went through an integration, I mean, people were talking about, oh, we have our swim lanes, we have our swim lanes, we have our swim lanes. And it's very much jargon, business jargon these days
Mm-hmm.
about swim lanes. I finally just said, could you not say that again? because I looked over at her and I said, we sort of like to just jump in the pool and splash around. So
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for us just jumping in the water and splashing around a little bit more.
That's a great way to end this, actually jumping in the water and splashing around. So you mentioned your book. Can you mention its title again and how you can find it?
It's a book by the Work Futures Initiative called Unfiltered Voices. You can go to the Center for Healthy Workplace, or the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplace at UC Berkeley, their website, and we can put that into the podcast. And you can go and link. And we're not really selling them. I mean, it's an academic institution, but we are taking donations for it. So, and we're looking for key sponsors. We want that people that believe in the initiative, believe this is a kind of a movement that is better for all parties, whether it's the employer or the employee. That we're looking for, kind of trusted sponsors to move forward as well. So we'll make sure to share all that.
And then how do people get in touch with you?
I'm the easy part. Tracy.Wymer at KBM Hogue with a dash.com, or my personal email, tracy.wymer at gmail.com. So
excellent.
I keep myself pretty accessible. So
thank you so much for coming on, and thanks for the conversation, which I always love talking to you because we always go down rabbit holes, and it's always thought-provoking. So thanks so much. Thank you also to our viewers and our listeners. Obviously, you can listen to our podcast on any of your podcast platforms, Spotify or Apple. You can watch it on YouTube. You can go to bluesoundprofessional.com/Surroundscapes and see it there. Please come back. We post these sorts of conversations every week. And thank you so much for viewing, and thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Graeme. Always good chatting.